March 10th, 1905, Brockton, Massachusetts. The morning began like countless others at the R.B. Grover Shoe Factory. At precisely 7:30 a.m., the morning shift was well underway, a typical workday in full swing. 58 souls were unknowingly minutes away from their final moments. Women diligently worked at their sewing stations, their needles flying as they stitched leather into intricate patterns, while men exerted themselves hauling heavy materials across the bustling factory floor. Beneath all this industry in the damp, cavernous basement, the factory's steam boiler maintained its rhythmic low hum. It radiated a steady, comforting warmth, an utterly unremarkable presence that had faithfully powered the operations for years on end, its reliable pulse a constant reassurance. Just 20 minutes prior, the firemen had made their routine rounds passing the colossal machine without a hint of alarm, seeing nothing amiss, nothing to suggest the impending doom. Then, with an almost imperceptible crack, a single rivet stressed beyond its limit after years of relentless strain finally surrendered. The boiler didn't merely spring a leak, it didn't just rupture. It detonated with an unimaginable ferocity, transforming in an instant from a workhorse into a weapon. A monstrous 15 tons of iron tore upwards with an explosive roar, effortlessly ripping through the basement ceiling, then obliterating the first floor, continuing its horrifying ascent through the second floor, and finally erupting through the very roof of the factory. Impossibly, this colossal projectile, still airborne, soared across the street, a metallic leviathan defying gravity before crashing violently into someone's living room a staggering 300 feet away. The factory, shorn of its vital core, buckled and collapsed inward. A grotesque cascade of brick timber and human bodies plunged into the cavernous void where the boiler had stood mere seconds before. 58 lives were extinguished in a terrifying flash, all within the span of 5 horrific seconds. Some perished instantly, never even registering the cataclysm that engulfed them. Others, granted a fleeting fraction of time, had just enough opportunity to gaze upwards in disbelief, their faces etched with dawning horror before oblivion claimed them. Survivors would later recount the sound as the very earth tearing itself apart, a primordial shriek of tortured metal and collapsing masonry. The air immediately filled with the acrid, choking stench of superheated steam, mingling sickeningly with burning coal and something far more disturbing. Something organic, something that should never ever burn. Yet as horrifying as the Grover tragedy was, it was not an anomaly, nor was it the worst such disaster. What ultimately claimed those 58 lives was not a sudden, unpredictable anomaly, but a silent, invisible threat that had been accumulating, building relentlessly for years. It was in grim retrospect entirely predictable. The official investigators in their post-catastrophe reports would invariably point fingers blaming operator error. But they would be profoundly, tragically mistaken. This was neither the first nor the last time such an event would devastate a community. For a full 5 decades, engineers continued to construct these formidable machines, even with the growing, undeniable knowledge that such catastrophic failures were an inherent recurring risk. Why? Because without their tireless, albeit dangerous power, there could have been no industrial revolution, no sprawling cities, no recognizable modern world as we know it. The steam boiler was the undisputed engine of progress, powering literally everything. And the steep, often unseen cost of that transformative power was consistently measured in human lives. To truly grasp the profound reasons why they persisted in building these machines, one must first comprehend what rendered steam boilers utterly irreplaceable in their era. For half a century, the steam boiler stood as the indispensable engine of civilization. This is no mere exaggeration. Before the advent of widespread steam power factories were geographical captives, their very existence dictated by natural constraints. You had to build where the river flowed swiftly enough to turn water wheels, where horses could reliably haul heavy loads, where brute human muscle could provide the necessary force. But steam, with its boundless, concentrated energy, shattered every one of those limitations. A boiler could be situated almost anywhere. Feed it coal and water, and it would deliver consistent, scalable, seemingly limitless power on demand. Consequently, factories were no longer tethered to riverbanks. Textile mills sprouted across Massachusetts hundreds of miles from any viable water power source. Mighty steel mills roared to life in Pittsburgh, transforming the landscape, and paper mills emerged across the vast expanse of the Great Lakes region. Industrial production, once painstakingly slow, exploded virtually overnight, and boilers in turn permeated every facet of modern life and industry. Massive ships traversed vast oceans solely on boiler power, their mighty engines driving them across previously unimaginable distances. Hospitals, too, relied on them, heating entire complexes, ensuring patient comfort and hygiene. But their influence wasn't confined solely to heavy industry. Towering apartment buildings in burgeoning metropolises like New York and Chicago pumped life-giving steam through elaborate pipe networks, warming thousands of residents through the biting chill of winter. Thus, entire urban centers became utterly dependent on a machine that most inhabitants never even glimpsed. Municipal water systems, the very arteries of a growing city, relied critically on boiler-driven pumps to deliver clean water. Without these powerful mechanical hearts, cities simply couldn't expand beyond a certain circumscribed size. By the 1880s, every major industrial hub boasted hundreds of these boilers operating simultaneously, their collective hum a constant backdrop to urban life. Each successive generation of boilers grew progressively larger, relentlessly chasing ever greater efficiency. More steam meant the ability to power more machines, which in turn meant more workers, depending on a single increasingly massive point of potential failure. Consider a mid-sized textile mill in 1890. It might run 50 power looms, 20 carding machines, and a dozen presses, all drawing their immense power from just one solitary boiler. That single machine was the linchpin keeping 300 workers gainfully employed and, by extension, 300 families fed and sheltered. This one mechanical marvel stood as the stark difference between a thriving, functioning mill and an eerily empty, decaying building. The economic imperatives were utterly irresistible. Production costs plummeted by a staggering half when factories embraced steam power. But that remarkable efficiency was inextricably linked to an alarming concentration of risk. Therefore, while profit margins soared, sometimes doubling, the inherent danger multiplied exponentially, spreading silently through the industrial landscape. Entire new industries, previously unimaginable, suddenly became economically viable. The engineering on the surface seemed robust, thoroughly proven. Boilers had been operating reliably for decades. Thousands of them ran daily across the globe without apparent incident. Yet that impressive track record was in fact fostering a deeply perilous false sense of confidence. Consequently, the industry embraced safety through repetition as its most treacherous fundamental assumption. Success measured by ever-increasing scale cunningly masked the insidious growing threat that lay beneath the surface. So, what exactly could possibly go so catastrophically wrong? Let's consider the sheer reach and ubiquity. Manchester, New Hampshire, a bustling industrial center, counted 218 boilers operating within its bounds in 1895. Lowell, Massachusetts, boasted an even more impressive tally with over 300. But Pittsburgh, the very heart of American industry, was home to thousands. Thus, the scale of these operations wasn't merely impressive. It was a vast powder keg, an intricate network of potential devastation, simply waiting for an errant spark. These were not small, isolated operations. Manchester's Amoskeag Mills alone, for instance, employed an astonishing 7,000 workers, a colossal workforce. Every single one of them, every family they supported, was utterly dependent on the continuous, unwavering power generated by those boilers. The textile mills churned out raw cotton, transforming it into finished cloth at rates that would have been utterly inconceivable a mere generation earlier. A single large mill could produce a staggering 4,000 yards of finished fabric per day. Enough cloth to fashion 8,000 shirts in a single day's output. But here's a critical factor that virtually no one bothered to calculate. If just one boiler failed, it didn't simply halt production. Its catastrophic failure could, and often did, trigger a chain reaction, taking out adjacent boilers within the same complex. One explosion could cascade, unleashing a wave of destruction. Paper mills in Wisconsin and Michigan, fueled by this immense power, were churning out an astounding 30 to 50 tons of finished paper every 24 hours. Steel mills across Pennsylvania relied on boiler-powered machinery to roll raw iron and precisely shape steel materials indispensable for the burgeoning railroads, monumental bridges, and towering buildings of a rapidly modernizing nation. The very infrastructure of modern America was being forged and erected by the relentless, all-encompassing force of boiler power. Municipal systems, too, depended on them with equal, if not greater, intensity. Cities needed vast quantities of water, but water to reach its destination required immense pressure. Therefore, massive boiler-driven pumps tirelessly moved millions of gallons per day from distant reservoirs to intricate distribution systems, hydrating entire urban populations. Boston's water system in 1900, for example, was responsible for propelling 15 million gallons daily through its network of powerful boiler-powered pumping stations. District heating systems in urban giants like Chicago and New York utilized vast central boiler plants to provide warmth to entire city blocks. Steam traveled through extensive underground pipes, reaching hundreds of individual buildings, apartment complexes, bustling office buildings, luxurious hotels. A single boiler plant possessed the capacity to heat 20 or more buildings, but if that crucial plant were to fail in the depths of January, thousands of people would face the grim prospect of freezing. Consequently, these machines were far more than mere industrial equipment. They were, in essence, life support systems for entire cities, their reliable operation a matter of literal survival. The economic impact of steam power was nothing short of staggering. A factory that integrated steam power could dramatically increase its production by 3 to 5 times while simultaneously slashing labor costs by a remarkable 40%. However, this profound efficiency meant that an ever greater amount of capital was tied up in a single formidable machine. Therefore, the economic pressure to keep that boiler running day in and day out was truly enormous, almost unbearable. A textile mill employing 500 workers with traditional water power could achieve superior output with only 300 workers, once it adopted steam, producing twice as much cloth. The cost savings were not just marginal. They were revolutionary, fundamentally reshaping industries and economies. And this revolution, once ignited, spread globally. Britain alone housed tens of thousands of boilers. Germany, France, and every other industrialized nation meticulously built their booming economies on the exact same steam-powered foundation. But this unprecedented scale came with a critical design choice, one that at the time virtually no one questioned. To maximize efficiency, boilers were strategically positioned at the absolute center of operations, often inside the main building, directly surrounded by workers, precisely where their immense power was most immediately needed. Moving steam through long pipes inevitably led to significant losses of both heat and pressure, an inefficiency that industrial barons simply could not tolerate. But here's the chilling realization that in hindsight should have stopped everyone dead in their tracks. Therefore, they deliberately placed a machine storing an unfathomable, catastrophic amount of energy right in the bustling heart of the workplace. That decision, while making perfect economic sense in the short term, meant essentially storing the equivalent of half a ton of TNT, a volatile, destructive force directly adjacent to families striving desperately to earn a living. And that brings us to the actual physical embodiment of this technological paradox. Let me illustrate what they actually built. Consider the sheer scale. A typical Lancashire boiler stretched an imposing 30 feet long and measured 8 feet across. Imagine, if you will, a horizontal cylindrical behemoth the size of a railroad tank car ensconced in your factory basement, a mere 10 feet from the working factory floor above. Its sturdy shell was meticulously constructed from iron plates, each a formidable half-inch thick. Crucially, it was iron, not the superior, more ductile steel of later eras. These massive plates were initially cast in roaring foundries, then heated until they glowed a vivid, almost incandescent orange before being rolled and painstakingly formed into shape while still incredibly hot. The heat emanating from these processes was nothing short of infernal. Men toiled in heavy leather aprons and thick gloves, yet severe burns were an unavoidable routine hazard of the job. Each individual plate weighed over 300 pounds before even being maneuvered into its final position. But cast iron, for all its perceived strength, harbors a profound hidden weakness. Therefore, every single plate, despite its robust appearance, carried invisible flaws, inherent imperfections inherited from the violent casting process itself. Minute gas bubbles, microscopic inclusions of impurities, and subtle structural inconsistencies. These latent defects would years later become the dreaded crack initiation points, silently compromising the integrity of the entire structure. The plates meticulously overlapped at their seams, creating joints that absolutely had to be hermetically sealed, and that precisely is where the rivets entered the picture. Rivets were the critical fasteners holding the entire immense assembly together. Each rivet, a stout 3/4 of an inch in diameter, was crafted from an iron rod precisely cut to length, then heated in a roaring forge until it shone with an almost blinding white-hot intensity. The cacophony in a riveting shop was truly deafening. The rhythmic, skull-jarring clang of heavy hammers striking red-hot iron, the metallic ringing sounding like colossal bells, men shouting themselves hoarse just to be heard over. The continuous ear-splitting din. These glowing rivets were then driven with immense force through pre-drilled holes in the overlapping plates. A highly specialized team of riveters worked in precise, perilous coordination. One man expertly heated the rivet, another deftly positioned it into the hole. A third, wielding a heavy hammer, forged the head, while a fourth, the bucker, braced the other side with a massive iron bar known as a dolly. The powerful hammering compressed the hot iron, forcing it to expand and completely fill the hole. As it cooled, the rivet contracted, exerting a tremendous vice-like force that pulled the plates together with incredible tension. But here's a fundamental flaw that the engineers of the era critically underestimated. Therefore, a single boiler often required more than 2,000 rivets, each one meticulously driven by hand. And each one in turn created a new localized stress concentration point within the iron. Because drilling a hole by its very nature removes crucial material, and removing material invariably creates a weakness. Every single rivet hole was a potential locus where microscopic cracks could and eventually would begin their insidious journey. The mathematical calculations of the time confidently asserted that the rivets would hold, but those calculations tragically assumed perfect installation, absolutely flawless material, no corrosion, and no metal fatigue over time. Reality, as always, was far messier, far more unforgiving. The fire tubes, an internal component of the boiler, were arguably even more impressive in their design and demanding in their function. Two massive tubes, each 4 feet in diameter, ran the entire 30-foot length of the boiler. These were also rolled from thick iron plates, seamed and riveted together, much like the outer shell. These tubes had to possess sufficient strength to contain the inferno of fire burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, all while being constantly enveloped and cooled by the surrounding water. Thermal stress was an unyielding, relentless force. The interior surface of the tube, directly exposed to the flames, constantly sought to expand from the intense heat. Conversely, the exterior was simultaneously being cooled by the water, creating a perpetual thermal tug-of-war. But thermal expansion, a fundamental law of physics, pays no heed to human engineering constraints. Therefore, this constant differential in temperature created immense warping pressure every single time the boiler was brought into operation. Day after day, year after year, these vital tubes were slowly, imperceptibly tearing themselves apart from the inside. Installation itself was an engineering marvel, a logistical nightmare. How precisely does one maneuver 20 tons of iron into the confines of a basement? The answer was painstakingly and with extreme caution. Buildings were frequently constructed around the boiler, or at the very least the boiler room was purpose-built for it. Foundations had to be extensively reinforced, composed of solid brick or concrete capable of supporting the immense static weight without the slightest hint of settling. Because settling even a fraction of an inch inevitably meant stress. Stress meant insidious cracks, and cracks ultimately meant catastrophic failure. The boiler rested on massive mounting bolts, each one a robust 18 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. These bolts weren't merely designed to bear the colossal weight, they were also intended to restrain the boiler to anchor it firmly should something go catastrophically wrong. Therefore, in theory, if a boiler attempted to launch itself skyward, those formidable bolts were supposed to be the only thing standing between it and the ceiling above. That was the comforting theory, at least. In stark, brutal practice, when the true, unimaginable forces of an exploding boiler unleashed their fury, those bolts frequently sheared clean through like butter, offering little to no resistance. Daily operation of these behemoths demanded constant, unwavering attention and skill. The fireman, a crucial figure, arrived before dawn. His solemn responsibility to build the fire, painstakingly bring the boiler up to its requisite operating pressure, and then meticulously maintain that pressure throughout the entire arduous shift. Coal consumption was staggering. A mid-sized boiler could easily burn through 2 to 3 tons of coal per day. That massive quantity of fuel had to be shoveled by hand into the roaring furnace hour after grueling hour. But the quality of coal varied wildly. Therefore, one day, a fireman might be fortunate enough to receive clean, efficient anthracite. The next, he might contend with soft, bituminous coal laden with impurities and a high sulfur content, leading to drastically different burn rates and heat outputs. The fireman was forced to adjust his firing technique constantly, a demanding, relentless dance with fire and pressure. He also had to monitor the water level with ceaseless vigilance. If the water dropped too low, the crown sheet, the critical top plate of the fire tube, would overheat dangerously and inevitably fail. If it climbed too high, the boiler lost precious efficiency. Pressure was a constant obsession. If it built too high, steam had to be vented to prevent disaster. The job was not for the faint of heart. It demanded immense skill, experience, and an unceasing, almost superhuman vigilance. But human vigilance, by its very nature, is fallible. Attention, even the most focused, inevitably wanders even for a split second. Therefore, just one single fleeting mistake could and frequently did result in the immediate death of everyone in the building. And in the relentless, demanding environment of industrial labor, mistakes were not just possible, they were utterly inevitable. And all of this monumental machinery sat precariously on a foundation designed solely to bear immense weight, not to withstand dynamic force. No one, it seemed, genuinely questioned what might happen if such a colossal inert mass suddenly decided to move. No one engineered for the horrifying possibility that 20 tons of iron might in an instant transform into a high-velocity projectile. But sheer weight was not the sole problem the foundation had to contend with. Vibration was a constant, almost imperceptible tremor that permeated the entire structure. The turbulent flow of steam within the pipes created resonance, a subtle harmonic hum that subtly stressed connections. Thermal expansion and contraction, the daily ebb and flow of heat caused the entire assembly to subtly shift. But these subtle shifts, compounded relentlessly over time, led to catastrophic degradation. Therefore, over years of incessant operation, mortar joints in the solid brick foundation would inevitably crack. Mounting bolts, once tightly secured, would gradually work loose, imperceptibly, losing their grip. The machine, this supposed symbol of static power, was slowly, invisibly preparing to tear itself free from its moorings. And chillingly, virtually nobody was regularly checking for these insidious signs of impending failure. But there was an even deeper, more fundamental problem that the engineers of the era simply couldn't see, an insidious force that was quite literally killing people from the inside out. This was the hidden threat. On the surface, a steam boiler appears utterly benign, deceptively harmless. And therein lies the core of the problem. It hums with a steady, reassuring rhythm, radiates a gentle, comforting warmth, and has been operating flawlessly, or so it seems, for years. Workers pass by it countless times every shift, utterly oblivious to the dormant power within. But this calm demeanor is profoundly deceptive. Therefore, familiarity, instead of breeding caution, bred a dangerous, fatal contempt. Inside that massive cylindrical vessel, you are simultaneously storing an astronomical amount of energy in two distinct yet mutually amplifying forms: immense pressure and intense heat. Water at atmospheric pressure, as basic physics dictates, boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Simple enough. But at 150 pounds per square inch, psi of internal pressure water astonishingly remains liquid until it reaches a searing 366 degrees Fahrenheit. At 200 pounds per square inches, it stays liquid well past 400 degrees Fahrenheit. You are essentially holding water in a superheated state, maintaining its liquid form only by the sheer crushing pressure of its container. Release that pressure suddenly violently, and the water doesn't gently boil away. It instantaneously flashes into steam, undergoing a phase change of cataclysmic proportions. 1 gallon of superheated water explosively transforms into 1,600 gallons of steam in a mere fraction of a second. This is not a phase change. It is quite unequivocally an explosion. Therefore, the total energy stored within a single active boiler at its operating pressure is roughly equivalent to detonating half a ton of TNT. That immense destructive energy sits there patiently waiting every single second the machine continues to run. But the sheer magnitude of stored energy was only half of the perilous equation. The true insidious threat lay within the very container, holding it the iron plates themselves, perpetually under immense, unyielding stress. Every morning when the firemen meticulously lit the coal, the metal shell of the boiler expanded as it heated up a phenomenon known as thermal expansion. Iron expands approximately 7/1000ths of an inch per foot of length for every 100 degrees of temperature increase. A 30-foot boiler expanding from a cool 70 degrees to a scorching 400 degrees would grow nearly 3/4 of an inch in length. That might not sound like much in isolation, but when you consider thousands of pounds of rigid iron being forcibly compelled to expand against immovable mounting bolts and unyielding brick foundations, the resulting internal stress is absolutely enormous, a constant, silent battle within the material. And every night when the roaring fire died down, the metal contracted as it cooled, a process of thermal cycling. The iron expanded and contracted, shifted and flexed, day after day, week after week, year after relentless year. But metal, unlike human memory, doesn't forget. Therefore, each individual expansion and contraction created minute internal stress that silently accumulated, building up invisibly within the material's crystalline structure. That stress inexorably concentrated at points of discontinuity, at the myriad rivet holes, at the overlapping seam joints, at any location where the material's uniformity was even slightly disrupted. Microscopic cracks, insidious and imperceptible, began to form deep inside the iron. They originated at these critical stress points, sharp corners, drilled holes, areas where the very grain structure of the iron was violently disrupted. These cracks then propagated slowly, incrementally through the material, growing ever larger with each successive thermal cycle. This was metal fatigue, a silent assassin. It doesn't announce its presence, makes no sound, doesn't alter the visible appearance of the surface, yet it is relentlessly, patiently killing the material from the inside. Therefore, it accumulates imperceptibly, deceptively, until the entire structure reaches its absolute limit, its breaking point, and then without warning it fails all at once catastrophically. The material itself, cast iron, had inherent limitations that no one in 1890 fully comprehended. Cast iron boasts excellent compressive strength. Squeeze it, and it holds firm, allowing it to bear tremendous weight without even a tremor. But its tensile strength, its ability to resist being pulled apart, is notoriously terrible. Pull it, and it cracks with alarming ease. Engineers of the era understood this principle, but their calculations were based on static loads. They meticulously figured out how much pressure a boiler could safely contain if that pressure remained absolutely constant. What they tragically failed to account for was cyclical loading pressure that varied temperature, that constantly changed material, that was being repeatedly stressed and relaxed thousands of times over its projected operational life. A pressure vessel, by its very design, creates immense tension in its shell. The internal pressure relentlessly tries to expand the cylindrical structure. The iron must therefore constantly resist that expansion. This is pure tensile stress, the exact force that cast iron is worst at handling. Engineers knew iron failed in tension, but they calculated based on static loads, not the cumulative ravages of cyclical stress. Therefore, this fundamental difference in understanding would ultimately prove fatal. A boiler that could safely contain 150 pounds per square inch on its first day of operation might, after 5 years of relentless use, tragically fail at a mere 120 pounds per square inch. The material was silently degrading, the microscopic cracks were relentlessly growing, but nothing visible, absolutely nothing changed on the surface. The boiler looked perfectly fine, still humming its deceptive tune. But even if they had somehow possessed the foresight to understand metal fatigue, there was yet another insidious problem: they simply couldn't perceive corrosion. The quality of water used in these boilers varied wildly from one location to another. River water, well water, municipal tap water, each contained different mineral compositions: calcium, magnesium, iron, and myriad other dissolved solids. These minerals, under the extreme heat and pressure, deposited on the interior surfaces of the boiler as scale, a hard, crusty buildup that acted as an insulator, preventing the water from effectively cooling the iron. This might sound harmless, perhaps even protective, but scale, in fact, created dangerous hot spots. Therefore, these were localized areas where the iron became significantly hotter than it should have, precisely because the cooling effect of the surrounding water was tragically blocked. Hot spots, in turn, meant intense localized thermal stress. And beneath this insulating layer of scale, an even more sinister process was underway: corrosion relentlessly eating away at the vital iron. Oxygen in the water reacted with the iron to form rust, which is significantly weaker than the original metal, far, far weaker. Therefore, even as the boiler presented a flawless, reassuring facade on the outside, its critical interior was being slowly devoured, its walls growing thinner, the material steadily losing its strength, and nobody, absolutely nobody, could see this devastating process unfolding. And crucially, there was simply no way for them to definitively see or measure the accumulating damage. No advanced sensors existed. No ultrasound imaging, no sophisticated X-ray inspection technology was available. The technological means to detect these hidden flaws simply had not been invented. Inspection methods were, by modern standards, incredibly primitive. A boiler inspector in 1890 typically relied on nothing more than a hammer and his keen sense of hearing and sight. He would tap on the shell of the boiler and listen intently. A hollow sound might indicate scale buildup or possibly corrosion, but it was far from a precise science. Therefore, it was little more than educated guesswork, an attempt at inspection dressed up as empirical assessment. He would diligently look for visible cracks on the exterior, but the most dangerous cracks, the ones that truly mattered, always started deep inside. By the time they finally propagated to the surface, becoming visible, the boiler's integrity was already catastrophically compromised. A simple sight glass provided a rudimentary indication of the water level. A basic pressure gauge displayed the internal pressure. These two rudimentary instruments were the only windows into the perilous processes occurring inside 10 tons of pressurized iron. Operators were essentially flying blind, implicitly trusting that everything beneath the unyielding surface remained perfectly intact. Safety valves, ingenious spring-loaded mechanisms designed to pop open and release excess steam if pressure climbed too high, did exist. That concept sounds inherently reassuring until one examines how they were actually deplorably used. They were routinely undersized, a short-sighted measure to save on immediate installation costs. A properly engineered safety valve, one capable of venting the full, immense steam output of a large boiler, cost significant money and occupied valuable space. But smaller, inadequate valves were considerably cheaper. Therefore, factory owners often installed woefully insufficient protection, sacrificing long-term safety for immediate upfront savings. Compounding this, these valves frequently corroded shut due to constant exposure to superheated steam and mineral deposits. Calcium from the hard water would cake around the valve seat, effectively sealing it. The crucial springs would weaken from prolonged heat exposure. And perhaps most disturbingly, operators frequently tied them down or plugged them entirely. Why? Because venting precious steam meant wasting fuel. Fuel, of course, cost money. Wasting fuel meant lower steam output, which in turn meant reduced factory production. And reduced production inevitably meant having to explain to management why profits had dipped. Therefore, the one crucial system specifically designed to prevent catastrophic failure was routinely disabled, often deliberately, all to save a few pennies per day. These monstrous machines sat there humming their calm, deceitful song while silently storing catastrophic, world-ending force, oblivious to the workers who walked past day after day. They toiled with them daily, hearing the relentless, steady hiss, feeling the comforting warmth radiating from their massive forms, yet seeing absolutely nothing threatening in their imposing presence. The insidious danger, however, was fundamentally invisible, precisely because it had become so profoundly familiar, integrated as just another mundane piece of the factory's colossal structure, as commonplace as the very walls that enclosed them, or the floor beneath their feet. Engineers of the era possessed a rudimentary understanding of some facets of this technology. They grasped the basic principles of pressure and, to a limited extent, comprehended the properties of the materials employed. But overshadowing any technical apprehension was an utterly overwhelming economic logic. By the burgeoning industrial landscape of the 1890s, literally thousands upon thousands of these immense machines relentlessly powered the burgeoning industrial world. Factories scattered across America, Britain, and indeed throughout the entirety of Europe found themselves utterly dependent on the ceaseless output of these steam behemoths. Entire cities, vibrant hubs of commerce and population, had been meticulously constructed and developed around industries fueled by these boiler-driven systems. Consequently, for these economies, the notion of simply stopping their operation was not merely inconvenient, it was an utterly unthinkable option. Yet here lay the chilling, stark calculation that virtually nobody was willing to confront or articulate. To cease their function would in essence equate to grinding the very gears of civilization to a screeching halt, bringing modern life to a standstill. The inertia was simply too immense, too many livelihoods were tied to these operations, too much precious capital had been invested, and too much foundational infrastructure was already inextricably woven into the fabric of society. To simply walk away from such an entrenched system was an impossibility. Therefore, the ominous warnings that began to appear with increasing frequency were invariably explained away, conveniently dismissed as isolated anomalies, minor maintenance hiccups, random localized incidents, or simply acceptable losses, a callous accounting for human lives. And these portents of disaster weren't a new phenomenon. They had been steadily manifesting subtly yet persistently for a great many years. One might well ask, wait, what warnings? It was the discernible pattern, a progression of small, seemingly insignificant failures that always came first. Tiny, almost imperceptible cracks would appear in tubes, allowing water to weep rather than gush into the scorching firebox. You might catch the faint, unsettling sound of hissing where absolute silence should have reigned, or spot delicate jets of steam escaping from joints, struggling under immense pressure. Firemen dutifully but perhaps dismissively would log these observations in the maintenance records, rivets weeping steam at the seams, little white plumes of vapor momentarily shooting from stressed joints. But these were universally dismissed, categorized merely as routine expected wear and tear. Thus, the alarming event of safety valves popping open during what was considered normal operation was simply recorded as another mundane maintenance item. The valve would violently pop, emitting a shrill scream of escaping steam for a few terrifying seconds before reluctantly resealing itself. All such occurrences were classified under the innocuous banner of routine maintenance. Tighten the rivets, patch the cracks, replace the errant valve. It was standard procedure, after all. Every complex machine demands regular upkeep. But critically, nobody ever connected these disparate occurrences into a coherent, alarming pattern. Therefore, it never occurred to anyone to ask the profoundly important question, why were these seemingly isolated issues appearing with such alarming regularity across different boilers in entirely different factories located in different states across the nation? The accumulated failures were attempting to impart a brutal, undeniable lesson, one that nobody blinded by complacency and economic necessity was willing to truly learn. Then came the catastrophic incidents, the kind that simply could not be ignored or rationalized away. In June 1888, at a bustling Kansas City packing plant, a crown sheet suffered a catastrophic failure. The crown sheet, for context, is the uppermost surface of the fire tube, the part most directly exposed to the infernal heat from below. If for any reason the water level within the boiler drops even slightly, this vital crown sheet becomes exposed directly to the merciless fire without the crucial life-sustaining cooling effect of the water above it. The iron, deprived of its coolant, rapidly overheats its molecular structure, weakening, causing it to lose its structural integrity and fail with terrifying suddenness. But the Kansas City disaster was far more horrific than most such failures. In a flash, the crown sheet collapsed violently inward, instantaneously dumping a torrent of superheated water directly onto a roaring fire burning at an unimaginable 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. The result was instantaneous explosive steam generation, a violent transformation of liquid to gas that tore the boiler apart with the destructive force of an enormous hand grenade. 12 workers perished instantly, and 30 more were grievously injured. The colossal boiler itself transformed into a deadly projectile, rocketed through 3 floors of the factory, and with terrifying momentum landed 2 entire blocks away, still radiating enough intense heat to ignite the very building it struck. 2 years later, in November 1890, a paper mill nestled in northern Wisconsin experienced another form of devastation, a tube rupture. The fire tubes within these boilers operated under unimaginable stress, intense heat raging inside, immense water pressure pressing from the outside, all compounded by relentless thermal cycling as temperatures fluctuated. A minuscule crack invisible to the naked eye began to propagate at a rivet hole where the tube was connected to the end plate. It then silently spread along the seam, a ticking time bomb, but tragically nobody saw it coming. Therefore, when the tube finally gave way, it split violently lengthwise, unleashing its contents. The superheated water trapped inside the fire tube instantaneously flashed to steam, but this time the explosion was directional, a focused blast. The boiler, with a terrifying roar, shot vertically upward, punching a massive hole clean through the factory roof, and then traveled over 100 yards in a parabolic arc before finally plunging into a nearby river. 17 lives were extinguished in an instant. When investigators, shocked by the sheer scale of the destruction, eventually arrived, they discovered the boiler half submerged, the water around it still ominously boiling from its latent heat. Then came March 1895 at a textile mill in Rhode Island, where a seam separation occurred, a catastrophic failure of riveted joints. The constant stress at the rivet holes, tiny points of vulnerability, concentrates intensely. Microscopic cracks form, then insidiously propagate between the holes until one by one the rivets shear. But when a sufficient number of these rivets fail simultaneously, the seam doesn't merely leak, it simply tears open with explosive force. Therefore, when enough rivets failed, the seam violently opened, releasing the pent-up energy. In Rhode Island, a longitudinal seam running the entire length of the boiler simply let go. The boiler's massive shell peeled open with horrifying ease, much like a fruit being stripped of its rind. 23 individuals lost their lives. The building didn't just collapse. It disintegrated, quite literally torn to shreds. The blast was so unbelievably violent that the boiler itself utterly disintegrated, never to be found intact, only fragments scattered across a quarter of a mile. The largest piece recovered, weighing a staggering 600 pounds, was found embedded 2 feet deep in the ground, a chilling 400 feet from its original foundation. These were three distinct and horrifying failure modes: crown sheet, collapse tube, rupture, and seam separation. Each incident in its brutal reality offered invaluable, albeit blood-stained, lessons about the precise mechanisms by which these machines failed. However, these critical lessons were tragically never effectively shared. Therefore, individual factory owners, driven by competitive pressures and a pervasive culture of secrecy, rarely, if ever, published comprehensive failure reports. In the cutthroat industrial landscape, competition meant jealously guarded secrets. You simply didn't broadcast your operational problems to your rivals. Insurance companies, of course, were intimately aware of the patterns. They meticulously tracked failures, calculated actuarial risks with grim precision, but they too did not publicly share this vital data. Consequently, every single factory was condemned to learn the very same devastating lessons independently each time at the incalculable cost of human lives. Geographical variations also revealed telling patterns of failure. Mills in the colder northern regions grappled with additional specific problems. The harsh winter months brought relentless freeze-thaw cycling. Water left neglected in pipes overnight could freeze solid, and the inexorable expansion of ice could easily crack critical fittings. Spring thaws necessitated meticulous checking of every component, but thorough inspections demanded both precious time and significant financial investment. Therefore, corners were frequently cut, leading to predictable disasters. Southern mills conversely contended with a different set of challenges related to water chemistry. Rivers in the south typically boasted a distinct mineral content, often leading to more aggressive corrosion and a significantly faster buildup of scale within the boilers. Therefore, it was observed that boilers in Georgia, for instance, often failed much faster than identical units operating in Massachusetts. Coastal mills faced the particularly corrosive wrath of salt. Salt water was exponentially worse than fresh, and even trace amounts of saline dramatically accelerated the rate of corrosion. The overall pattern was glaringly obvious to the insurance companies who dealt with the aftermath, but factory owners locked in their competitive silos refused to share data with one another. Therefore, competition meant secrets, and in this grim reality, secrets meant inevitable deaths. By the turn of the century, sophisticated actuarial tables had begun to reveal clear and undeniable correlations. Boiler age directly impacted failure rate. Operating pressure influenced failure severity, and water quality directly correlated with corrosion rates. All of it chillingly was statistically predictable. But mere statistics, however accurate, did not possess the power to prevent explosions, and so factories continued to construct new boilers and operate antiquated ones because stopping their operations unequivocally meant losing money. And some failures, it became terrifyingly clear, were far, far worse than others. One could only imagine the sheer devastation that unfolded when a boiler failed at its absolute full load. While most explosions typically occurred during the thermal stresses of startup or shutdown, occasionally a boiler would spectacularly fail at full operating pressure at maximum steam output, and with the entirety of its colossal stored energy unleashed. Therefore, under these peak conditions, the resulting destruction multiplied exponentially, reaching levels of unimaginable violence. So what precisely happens when one of these infernal machines finally lets go? The sheer unbridled violence is beyond human comprehension. A boiler explosion unfolds faster than the very speed of human perception, moving from initial failure to utter deafening silence in less than 5 seconds. It typically begins with a single, seemingly trivial point of failure. A rivet pops, a seam splits, a tube cracks, an opening perhaps no larger than your thumbnail. But through that minuscule breach, water, superheated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit and under immense pressure of 150 pounds per square inches, violently escapes. Therefore, the pressure drop is instantaneous and catastrophic. The superheated water no longer contained doesn't merely boil. It detonates into steam, expanding an astonishing 1600 times its original volume. The underlying physics is deceptively straightforward. The rapid expansion of water to steam releases an immense destructive energy. That energy must go somewhere, but the boiler shell designed for containment simply cannot endure it. Therefore, the iron, despite its bulk, is not nearly strong enough. It disintegrates, torn apart by forces beyond its capacity. The staggering energy released in a typical boiler explosion is roughly equivalent to half a ton of TNT. However, its release mechanism is fundamentally different. TNT detonates, creating a supersonic shockwave that rips through the air. But boilers do not detonate in the same manner. Therefore, they deflagrate. The explosion is subsonic, yet it remains utterly catastrophic. Unlike a meticulously designed bomb engineered to fragment uniformly, a boiler ruptures along its inherent weak points, the rivet lines, the seams, any area where stress has been relentlessly concentrating for years. Therefore, the outcome is utterly unpredictable, chaotic, and terrifyingly deadly. Iron plates shear violently along their rivet lines. The rivets themselves, small pieces of metal weighing only a few ounces, are transformed into lethal projectiles. When a seam fails, these seemingly innocuous rivets accelerate with terrifying speed. Therefore, investigators meticulously calculated velocities often exceeding 100 miles per hour. A mere 3-ounce rivet traveling at that speed possesses enough kinetic energy to penetrate 3 inches into solid brick. Investigators found these deadly projectiles embedded deep in timber beams, buried firmly in the ground, and most horrifyingly lodged within the bodies of victims. The human body, frail and vulnerable, stands no chance against a rivet moving at such velocity. It punches through, leaving clean, precise holes. Bone offers no resistance, failing to slow its passage. Internal organs rupture instantly, and blood pressure plummets. Some victims were discovered still standing dead before their bodies could even register the impact or begin to fall a rivet, having passed completely through their torsos. Iron plates, however, are far, far worse. A substantial section of a boiler shell might weigh 400 pounds, a half-inch thick slab of iron, 3 feet by 4 feet in dimension. But when it shears free, it doesn't just fly, it tumbles wildly, spinning through the air. Therefore, those massive, sharp edges honed by the shearing forces become terrifying, indiscriminate guillotines. One grim report from a Massachusetts explosion described a plate found buried edge first in the ground, as if a colossal knife had been flung with unimaginable force. It had sliced clean through a wooden wall, hurtled through 20 feet of open air, and then planted itself so firmly in the earth that it took 4 strong men with pry bars to extract it. Having buried itself 2 feet deep, another such plate in a single terrifying pass decapitated 2 men, with a chillingly clean cut its edge, sharp enough from the shearing force to act like an executioner's blade. But even worse than the shrapnel is the sheer destructive force of the blast wave itself. The sudden catastrophic pressure release within the boiler creates an immense pressure differential. Inside the boiler room, the pressure instantly spikes to unimaginable levels, then precipitously drops, but the subsequent wave of compressed air propagates outward at the very speed of sound. Therefore, it relentlessly strikes walls, it slams into people, it impacts everything in its path. The intense overpressure shatters everything within a 50-foot radius. Glass doesn't merely crack. It instantaneously vaporizes, turning into a fine, deadly powder that flies outward like a violent sandstorm. Brick doesn't crumble. It explodes into countless fragments, each shard becoming a secondary lethal projectile. Timber beams don't simply break. They splinter into thousands of razor-sharp pieces. And tragically, the human body responds in precisely the same devastating way. Therefore, bones don't break cleanly. They shatter into myriad fragments. Femurs, the strongest bones in the body, snap like dry twigs. Ribs collapse inward, puncturing vital organs such as the lungs and heart. Soft tissues rupture violently from the extreme pressure differential. Lungs collapse even if a person isn't breathing at the precise moment of impact. Eardrums burst and blood vessels in the eyes rupture, often leaving survivors permanently blind. Internal organs hemorrhage solely from the shockwave's brutal force. The liver tears, the spleen ruptures. Even if you are not struck by a single piece of debris, the pressure wave alone can be a fatal blow. Death might come hours later from internal bleeding, the victim perhaps walking around utterly unaware that they are already dying. A military artillery shell by design is engineered to fragment into predictable pieces, meticulously calculated to create a specific kill radius. But a boiler explosion is infinitely worse, far more brutal and indiscriminate. Therefore, it is uncontrolled, utterly unpredictable, and there is absolutely no safe distance, particularly not within a building where the confining walls contain the blast and reflect its destructive energy, or where the ceiling funnels the force downward. In such a scenario, the building itself transforms into part of the weapon. And then the steam. Superheated, invisible 400 degrees Fahrenheit or hotter, it rushes to fill every cleared space. Steam at such an extreme temperature does not behave like the visible vapor from a simmering kettle. It remains entirely invisible until it begins the process of condensing, by which point, tragically, you've already been catastrophically exposed. Therefore, it doesn't merely burn the flesh, it cooks it. Exposed skin instantly flash boils. Clothing, typically a barrier, offers no protection whatsoever. Cotton ignites wool, violently shrinks and binds. Leather hardens and cracks into painful shards. But the true horrifying damage is internal. To inhale this superheated vapor is to flash boil your lungs from the inside out. The precious moisture in your airways instantly turns to steam, causing tissue to swell instantaneously, brutally blocking the airway. You become unable to breathe, unable to scream, unable to do anything but slowly, agonizingly drown in your own body fluids. Survivors, the pitifully few who live through such an ordeal, universally describe the sensation as an unimaginable fusion of drowning and burning simultaneously. Their throats sealed shut, their lungs rapidly filled with fluid. Third-degree burns consumed their entire bodies in mere seconds. The moisture in their lungs vaporized, tissues swelled, and airways constricted. Some succumbed immediately from the shock. Others died, agonizing minutes later, from asphyxiation. Many more perished days later from the horrific burns or the inevitable rampant infections that set in because so much of their protective skin had been utterly destroyed. A very few, survived. But they were never again the same faces, melted beyond recognition, hands fused into grotesque claws, voices irrevocably destroyed, their lives shattered beyond repair. The cascade of destruction extended far beyond the immediate blast zone. At the Grover factory explosion, the boiler, a monstrous projectile, not only crossed a public street, but buried itself deep within a residential area, a full 300 feet away. A shocking 14 of the 58 dead never even worked at the factory, never once set foot in its dangerous confines. They were merely nearby innocent bystanders, caught in the wrong place at the wrong terrible time, a mother hanging laundry, a child playing innocently in a yard, a man walking to the local store, all dead because cold iron cares nothing for property lines or the sanctity of life. But the destruction propagated in relentless waves from the epicenter. Therefore, adjacent buildings sharing their walls with the ruptured factory lost their structural integrity and collapsed inward, victims of the sympathetic blast. It wasn't just the building containing the boiler that was obliterated. The structures immediately next to it were also irrevocably lost. Fires, a secondary wave of devastation, ignited almost instantly from scattered burning coal, from ruptured gas lines, and from the boiler's own firebox, spilling live fuel across the wreckage. The smell survivors recounted was utterly overwhelming: burning coal, burning wood, and most horrifyingly burning flesh. An olfactory assault so profound it was something you never forgot, something that recurred in nightmares decades later. A woman at a sewing station 3 rooms away from the explosion was killed instantly by a rivet that punched clean through 2 thick brick walls. Her life extinguished before her bewildered co-workers could even comprehend the deafening sound. A man on the top floor plunged 4 harrowing stories when the floor beneath him simply vanished. Miraculously, he survived the initial fall, only to die 2 days later from grievous internal injuries. The factory, the heartbeat of the community, shut down instantly, not gradually, not after careful assessment, but in a devastating 5-second flash, because there was simply nothing left. Hundreds of jobs vanished. Hundreds of families plunged into immediate destitution. Streets filled with frantic families desperately searching for answers. Who was inside? Who was dead? Who miraculously was still alive? Nobody knew. The confusion was absolute, a maelstrom of grief and despair. Morgues, typically small and unprepared for such a scale of tragedy, overflowed. Bodies were laid out grimly in the street, covered hastily with sheets, as families walked the agonizing line, lifting each sheet, searching for familiar faces, for any sign of their loved ones. Hospitals ran out of beds, out of life-saving morphine, out of essential bandages. Doctors and nurses, overwhelmed and exhausted, worked tirelessly in hallways, in waiting rooms, anywhere there was a sliver of space to treat the wounded. Towns had established procedures for fires and floods, but not for this utterly unprecedented horror. The haunting question lingered. After every single explosion, investigators, often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the devastation, would arrive, meticulously examine the wreckage, and then invariably everyone would rebuild the same design, the same inherent risk. Why? Because the economic cost of stopping production entirely was simply deemed greater than the cost of continuing, despite the human toll. But here was the grim economic calculation that permeated every decision. A factory without a functional boiler was, by definition, a dead factory. 300 workers would instantly find themselves unemployed, meaning 300 families would be left without a vital income. The mill owner would suffer crippling revenue losses. The town itself would see its essential tax base erode, diminishing public services. Suppliers would lose crucial contracts, their own businesses reeling. The economic ripples of a single boiler failure spread outward, devastating entire communities. Therefore, they rebuilt. Insurance companies, ever the pragmatists, covered the financial cost. The boiler manufacturers, ever eager, delivered a shiny replacement. Workers, desperate for wages, eventually returned. Production resumed. The tragic, deadly cycle continued, seemingly without end. Who then truly benefited from this relentless, deadly cycle? Factory owners successfully kept their businesses operating. Boiler manufacturers continued to sell their dangerous machines, ensuring their own prosperity. Insurance companies continued to collect premiums, which were chillingly already priced to account for the expected, inevitable losses. But who bore the true unbearable cost? Therefore, it was the workers, the grieving families, the shattered towns, the ordinary people who simply couldn't leave, who desperately needed the wages to survive, who lived their entire lives in the ominous shadow of these machines because they had no other viable choice. Anything had to break this horrific cycle. But remarkably, it wouldn't be what most might assume. It wasn't primarily regulation. It wasn't the spontaneous outrage of a horrified public. It was rather pure, unadulterated economics. Something demonstrably cheaper, something fundamentally safer had to emerge, and eventually it did. Investigators, in their post-disaster analyses, meticulously weighed fragments of shattered metal, precisely measured distances of thrown debris, and diligently collected data. Yet tragically, they often missed the most profoundly important questions. Why, for instance, were these immensely powerful and dangerous machines permitted to operate indoors in the first place, often amidst crowded workplaces? Why were critical safety systems routinely disabled or overridden? Why were inspections so notoriously superficial, often little more than a cursory glance? But those fundamental, challenging questions rarely, if ever, made it into their official reports. Therefore, the conclusions invariably came back to the same convenient, often simplistic explanations: operator error or defective materials. A single cause was identified, the case was summarily closed, insurance companies paid out their predetermined claims, and companies promptly ordered replacement boilers of the same design, same capacity, and thus harboring the same inherent risk. So if years of investigations failed to halt the carnage, if the pragmatism of insurance companies couldn't stop it, and if the agonizing deaths of countless workers didn't compel change, what finally did? The answer, ironically, is not a testament to enlightened safety principles or moral outrage. Here it is. Boilers did not disappear from factories primarily because they were dangerous. They disappeared because something objectively cheaper came along. Not safety, not enlightened regulation, but economics. Initial attempts at solutions, it must be noted, were predictable, though limited in their efficacy. Better safety valves with higher flow rates, stricter pressure limits enforced by vigilant inspectors, and mandatory annual inspections. While these measures offered some marginal improvements, they did not address the fundamental problem. Therefore, explosions did indeed become less frequent over time. But less frequent is a far cry from zero. The core existential problem remained stubbornly in place. Factories were still storing catastrophic amounts of energy indoors within volatile vessels. However, genuine technical advances eventually made a real and tangible difference. The adoption of steel in place of brittle cast iron was a significant step. Steel's tensile strength was nearly double that of its predecessor, offering far greater resistance to crack propagation and a substantially improved fatigue life under cyclical stress. But predictably, steel cost more, considerably more. Therefore, its adoption was agonizingly slow, hampered by economic considerations. Then came welding as a replacement for riveting, which proved to be truly revolutionary. Electric arc welding was becoming practically viable by the early 1900s. Welded seams entirely eliminated the inherent weakness of rivet holes, removing discontinuities and critical stress concentration points, creating a continuous monolithic material. And if executed properly, the welds themselves were actually stronger than the base metal. Therefore, this technological leap fundamentally changed everything about how robust pressure vessels could be designed and constructed, making them inherently safer. Water tube designs, instead of the traditional fire tube systems, represented another paradigm shift. Instead of enormous tubes containing raging fires, the new design featured numerous small tubes containing the water itself. Less water contained meant significantly less stored energy. While a water tube boiler might hold only a tenth of the water of an equivalent fire tube boiler, this difference was crucial. Therefore, if it failed, the ensuing explosion was proportionally dramatically smaller and far less destructive. Yet these crucial upgrades were undeniably expensive. A modern steel boiler could cost twice as much as its antiquated iron counterpart. Welding equipment was not yet commonplace, and skilled welders required extensive training and certification. Furthermore, water tube boilers were more complex to operate, demanding therefore more diligent maintenance. And perhaps most significantly, replacing a perfectly functional, albeit dangerous boiler meant costly downtime, weeks of lost production while the old unit was painstakingly removed and the new one installed. It was a substantial capital expenditure with no immediate return on investment. You weren't producing more product, merely producing it more safely. It was to factory owners a notoriously hard sell. Then, finally, truly transformative alternatives arrived: robust electric power grids. Centralized generating plants, massive and efficient, began producing electricity and distributing it cleanly and safely through networks of copper wires. This was nothing short of transformative for industry. Therefore, the grid efficiently moved energy without moving steam. This eliminated the need for dangerous high-pressure vessels at every single factory. Instead, factories could utilize simple, reliable electric motors or small, relatively safe oil and gas engines based on internal combustion, requiring no boiler, no fireman, and no massive coal storage. When an electric motor failed, you simply replaced it. No explosion, no mass casualties. But when a boiler failed, everyone within a 3-block radius could easily perish. Therefore, the terrifying concentration of risk, previously a defining characteristic of industrial production, was effectively eliminated. Electric power was also critically cheaper to operate. No fireman salaries, no costly coal deliveries, no inspection fees, and significantly no exorbitant insurance premium surcharges for a high-risk steam operation. Insurance companies, ever attuned to risk and cost, took immediate notice and began charging substantially, even prohibitively, higher premiums for any facilities that stubbornly insisted on operating steam boilers. Therefore, the actuarial math, the cold, hard numbers of risk versus cost, became utterly impossible to ignore for any sensible business owner. Large operations with significant capital reserves were the first to make the switch to electricity. Smaller mills gradually followed suit as the electric grid expanded into rural areas. By the 1930s, new factory construction rarely, if ever, included boilers in their designs. Architects simply stopped designing around them, rendering the dangerous behemoths obsolete. The human toll of this era is staggering. Between 1,880 and 1,930 over 5,000 people died in documented boiler explosions across the United States alone, a figure exceeding the total number of deaths incurred during the construction of the entire Panama Canal. But the true number unrecorded and lost to history is undoubtedly far higher. Therefore, when one adds the casualties from similar incidents across Europe and Canada, the global toll probably exceeds a horrifying 1,000,000 lives. The economic damage calculated in modern dollars would amount to billions. Today, most physical evidence of these tragedies is gone, scrapped, melted down, or deliberately forgotten. But from the literal wreckage, something truly permanent and invaluable emerged. The ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, established in 1914. This was the first truly comprehensive safety standard, meticulously outlining material requirements, rigorous design calculations, complete with mandatory safety factors, and stringent inspection intervals. But the most profound change was not merely technical, it was fundamentally philosophical. Therefore, the new maxim became, if it can fail, design for that failure. Modern pressure vessels are not inherently safer because they are impervious to failure. They are safer precisely because we realistically assume they will eventually fail, and we plan accordingly. Containment became mandatory, relief valves were meticulously sized for maximum potential output, and multiple redundant monitoring systems were put in place. You likely have pressure vessels operating safely within your own home right now, your water heater, your HVAC system. You trust them, and you absolutely should. Modern systems meticulously incorporate every hard-won lesson from that brutal era. Yet the immutable physics of steam has not changed. Therefore, water still expands 1,600 times when it vaporizes. The crucial difference is that we as a society have collectively learned to deeply respect the immense destructive power we are storing. Every single relief valve in operation today traces its lineage directly back to a catastrophic explosion. Each regulation, seemingly bureaucratic in its complexity, is quite literally written in blood. Memory, however, inevitably fades. Regulations over time can begin to feel like an onerous bureaucracy. Each new generation must, in its turn, relearn why these vital rules exist. The ultimate lesson is not that progress itself is inherently dangerous. Indeed, progress built our civilization. But the far more crucial lesson is that forgetting why we meticulously built these essential safeguards is profoundly existentially dangerous. Therefore, the storage of such immense energy is never truly free. Containment is never truly guaranteed without perpetual vigilance and the unwavering remembrance of the sacrifices made to ensure safety. Precisely right. We truly internalized that particular lesson only after enduring a profoundly harsh and unforgiving ordeal. A staggering 50,000 individuals sadly bore the immense financial and personal cost of that invaluable yet brutally acquired education. It is absolutely imperative that we never allow ourselves to forget this hard-won wisdom, for any lapse in collective memory inevitably condemns us to revisit those same painful, entirely avoidable trials. And rest assured, the tuition fees for relearning such fundamental truths will only continue to climb, never decreasing in their impact or escalating expense.